Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Priscilla Andrews. I'm the clinical manager with the Cancer Wellness Center, and I want to welcome you to the March edition of the CWC Staff Chat. This series was created as um, an opportunity for you to hear discussion between two clinicians talking about issues and concerns that come up for people who are living through a cancer experience. And I am so excited to be welcoming my colleague, one of the newest staff members, to join the clinical team at the Cancer Wellness Center, Michelle Matero. Michelle, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I was telling Michelle before we started here, I'm so excited to have her here today because we are going to be talking about parenting during a cancer diagnosis. And as somebody who works with adults and works with parents from time to time, I don't work with kids. So I am, like you in the audience, really excited to learn from Michelle and gain from her expertise. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you so
No
much.
pressure though, right? No pressure.
Yes, pressure, no pressure at all.
Just to start out with, if you could just share, you're a clinical associate with the center. You're also the coordinator for our child and teen programming. But before you came to the center in that capacity, you also had worked with children and families beforehand. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about what your background is that we are now benefiting from.
Absolutely. So before joining the center, I worked as a child life specialist. Um, Child life specialists, for those that don't know, are typically in a hospital or healthcare setting, working with families and children that have some type of illness, hospitalization. And now child life is kind of going a little bit more the non-traditional route, working outside of the hospital,
Hmm.
um, addressing things like grief in the family, trauma in communities. So it's been a really wonderful field to be a part of. Um, so for many years, I worked with children and families in that capacity. I also did some work as a child life specialist with Kellogg Cancer Center, where
Okay.
um, I specifically did consultations with parents and grandparents, anyone really that had children in their lives and um, had a new cancer diagnosis. And we're kind of like, where do I go from here? So that's been some really rich experience there that ultimately drew me to Cancer Wellness Center, and
Yeah.
hoping to be another support and resource to kids and families on their cancer journey.
Well, and I'm curious, it sounds like before you even moved into the therapist role, you were drawn to working with children and families that are in crisis. Um, I'm curious what drew you to that work in the beginning.
I've I've certainly always just loved working with kids and children and teenagers. Um, but I think when I first started some coursework kind of in this child life realm, I just saw the growth that can happen in kids and then just in adults when faced with trauma and crisis and illness, and how such a horrible, unexpected circumstance could really just be an opportunity that for families to just come together and strengthen um,
Yeah.
themselves as a unit. And that's just what's been really wonderful to see. And I love that I can be a part of that and hopefully um, shed some light on that and hope within families that this might be a really, really hard time, but these are some life lessons that you're able to kind of instill in young children, and not everyone
Yeah.
gets a chance to do that.
Yeah. And I think, for families, for parents, for kids, I think you're in that midst of that crisis and the stress of the crisis, that it's hard to imagine that there is that kind of post-traumatic growth that is possible. And I think the value of having sort of that beacon of light to say like, hey, you're going to get through this. I can help you get through this and get you to the other side. Um, I think something that comes up for me a lot with clients that have a child, and especially when they're newly diagnosed, is disclosing the diagnosis to their children. Um, and sometimes I'll get the question outright, like, when should I tell them? What should I tell them? Sometimes it'll just come up where the parent will tell me, oh, well, I'm going in for surgery and we're not going to tell them because, I'm not going to lose my hair. And so they just need to know that, mommy's going into the hospital. Um, or I think another thing that comes up too is, maybe another relative recently passed from a cancer diagnosis, or somebody, a, a friend's parent passed away from cancer. So I think parents get really reluctant around it. So I'm curious what guidance you provide parents, or that you would give parents around how to tell, when to tell, what to tell
Sure.
after they've gotten a cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points. First and foremost, I think it can be really hard when parents are first, delivered this news, and it's natural for your mind just to jump to the kids, right? How do I protect them? Um, and do I tell them? What do I tell them? Will they know, right? Like you said, I can just say I'm going into the hospital or have a doctor's appointment. But I think it's important to understand that kids are aware of way more than we think.
Mm.
So more than likely, if you think, you're kind of keeping this secret or holding something away from them, you're probably not. Um, and the other point you mentioned too of, right, a grandparent or someone at school, they might have heard about a family member, someone else having cancer and it not going well, right? Or them knowing that word cancer is associated with someone dying or someone having a really hard time in their family, their parent not looking the same. Um, so there's just this really big opportunity for educating them and just being honest. I think openness and honesty is so, so important.
Mm.
Um, I think, it's nice to talk this through with parents because very often they're dealing with their own, shock and perhaps denial and anger and sadness from this diagnosis that
Sure.
then to think about having that conversation with your children, it can just seem easier to put it off, to not have it.
Yeah.
So even, taking the time to deal with that yourself too is really important before having that conversation.
Well, and I think part of that raises something that I witness frequently, which is, as adults, we have a lot of baggage around what cancer means, because I think it's fair to say nobody gets to a certain age without knowing somebody with cancer, whether it be a family member or a friend. And unfortunately, even doesn't get to a certain age without knowing somebody that's died of cancer. So all of that kind of clouds how we as adults think of the word cancer, that a child is not going to have that concept, right? I mean, I don't know. I guess that's part of me checking in. Like, a child who's never heard the word cancer, they're not going to have the concept, the conceptualization that we come into it with.
Yeah, very possible, depending on their age. But like you said, many children too will have. It's possible that they have some experience with the word, or whether it's close to them or a little bit more removed.
Mm,
But I think that's why it's just so important, regardless of where
mm,
you stand with that, to name it, to say the word cancer. Um, tell them the type of cancer, because then if they know someone, that died of cancer, it's important to talk about how nobody's cancer is the same, right? Even if it is
mm,
the exact same type and stage and whatever, no one's cancer is going to be the same. And that's an opportunity to talk to your kids about that. And if they don't have a prior experience with it, just by saying the word too, it's um, we kind of take some of that scariness of it away.
mm.
Kids
It's
know.
not as ambiguous.
Yeah. And if we're, hesitant to to bring something up, they'll, more than likely associate some fear with that. And why
Hmm.
aren't they using that word? And
There's kind of that culture of silence that can get created
mhm,
where there's like a taboo, and
right,
that taboo can make things seem a lot scarier than it would if there was some language around it.
right.
And do you have like, you know, do you have advice you give parents about the timing from diagnosis? I think sometimes there's a reluctance of like in the immediacy of getting the diagnosis, there's testing and treatment planning. And a lot of times the parents or the person with the diagnosis doesn't even have a full picture of it yet. And I'm curious if you think there's a sort of, if there is a sweet spot, whether it be a point in the trajectory or what's sort of going on in the family amidst that would say now's the time.
Um, I would typically say get it started, start having those conversations. Um, I can certainly understand, and like you're saying, when the patient themselves doesn't really know what this trajectory is looking like, but as we know, things can change pretty quickly, for the better or worse. So I think just having those conversations initially and being honest, it's okay to say, I don't have all the answers right now. So I have a lot of questions for my doctors, and
Yeah.
I'm going to be making, you can count on me letting you know when I get some
Yeah.
answers. We'll come back to this. Uh,
Yeah.
it lets the kids just one, they know you're not keeping something from them because they're bound to then hear some whispers or phone calls being taken out of the room.
Yeah.
Um, so they're in the loop, but then they also know that, okay, maybe mom doesn't know everything right now, but when she does, I can count on her coming back to me and filling me in.
And I think, I mean, that reinforces a sense that I've had. And I think part of this is me checking in with you with some of the things that I've advised, even my clients, which is, if you're not being you're not being honest, or you're hiding something, then when you do disclose, you're going to have to rebuild trust with your child because they're not going to trust that they're going to know everything. So they're likely to be maybe even unnecessarily fearful because they think that you're trying to hide something from them.
Yeah.
Whereas if they trust that they're going to know what there is to know, then they don't have to worry about the unknown in the same way.
Hmm. Absolutely. And that, certainly goes for older children and teenagers. Because, right, if all of a sudden when you do share, you kind of have all of this information of, I've gone to a couple treatments and this is the plan, it is kind of like, well, where was I? Um,
Yeah.
and for even young children, you're showing them that they're a valued member of this family and that our family
Yeah.
talks about these things and involves one another. Um, so absolutely, I think, and again, I always like to say that there's no mistakes. So if a parent comes to me and is like, this is where I am, but I haven't told my kids because I thought everything was going to go okay and it's taking a turn,
Yeah.
it's okay. It's not, none of these mistakes can't be kind of undone and um, be repaired. So that's okay. Um,
Yeah.
but if you are able to ahead of it, I always do think the sooner the better. But
Yeah. And I think that like not letting that upfront hesitancy and maybe feeling like, oh, geez, did I screw this up by not saying something sooner, perpetuate itself even further, right? There's always sort of that chance for a little bit of humility as a parent, right? Like
yep,
maybe I could have told you sooner and I didn't have all the information, or I was scared, or I
yep.
wasn't sure how to do it, right? Because parents aren't perfect. Nobody's perfect. So
And I think that's a great way to handle it. If it was a little bit of a delayed, disclosure of just saying I was scared. I thought I needed to have all the answers before I told you, and realizing it's been it's been too long. I still don't have the answers, but I want to talk to you about it. Um,
mm,
and that kind of
yeah,
helps, even if there was a little bit of that hesitance, and perhaps mistrust, that easily rebuilds it.
yeah,
Understand, they can sympathize with their parent, and that's important too.
Do you have guidance that you give people as far as like how to go about starting the conversation? I mean, I know our intake coordinator, and I know from when I was on doing intakes where people would call us and say, well, we want to bring in our kids so you can tell them that, that I was diagnosed, which we're always like, well, we can help you feel more confident telling them. So, is there like a setting or kind of a frame that you recommend parents have? Or even like if there's multiple children, like do we sit them down all at the same time? Do we tell them separately? Especially if there's an age gap, I think that can come up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that's why, perhaps having some consultation before can just be helpful to talk through some of it. But I think some of the main things to consider, and every family's going to be different, and they know their kids best, and how they typically kind of converse and have some of these discussions. Um, certainly I won't recommend doing it, in the car on the way to school. But whatever works and seems really comfortable for the family, as far as it being, some people do like having perhaps something fun or something that the kids are looking forward to shortly after having a hard conversation.
Mm,
People don't want to plan anything, to just allow time to process. Um, it it can really depend. I think it's really important that, if there are two parents in the home, to be on the same page about the language, and um, how you'll be bringing it up. It can
mm,
be really, or who might take the lead. Um,
yeah.
the patient might have a harder time talking about some of it. So just having that conversation beforehand is important. Um, and then, as you mentioned, the age differences in kids. Usually, from families that I've spoken to and worked with, they usually find that that initial conversation, having the whole family together, feels right. Um, because there's certainly going to be more conversations to be had. Uh,
Yeah. It's not a one-time deal.
right, right. And so, again, the language might be different, that, a teenager and a preschooler are going to understand. But again, your preschoolers' attention spans going to be pretty short. So you can kind of make that short and sweet for them, see where they're at, maybe want to carry on
Mm.
them doing something else, and can continue following that conversation with your teen. Um, it just depends. Some families have found it much easier to have separate conversations with their kids. Um, it can be helpful just to talk through that first.
It seems like that if there is a co-parent kind of being on the same team about that.
Yeah.
And I hear like there's not one right fit answer, right? Like you can't say definitively have a family meeting, and you can't say definitively sit down with each child separately. Like you kind of have to know what your family, how your family operates, what your kids' needs are.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Might be best for you. And you might, it's an opportunity too for the parents just to learn what their kids know about.
Mm,
So, right, you're kind of opening it up. So it might be a really brief conversation that they want to check back later, or they might have a ton of questions. So sometimes that's hard too, because I want to, help prepare the parent a little bit for some questions that might follow up.
sure.
But then you don't want them to kind of get over prepared, or kind of worked up about what their child might ask, and then question, why didn't they ask me, or aren't they thinking about that?
Yeah.
It really just depends. And
Well, and it's interesting because I think that there's sort of like two ends of that spectrum when I hear you talking. Is I think on one end of the spectrum, the parents who are like, oh my God, like, what if my kid asks me if I'm going to die? How do I respond to that? And then at the other end is, I told them I had cancer and they don't seem to care. Like the kids don't ask questions. They're kind of like, okay. And I mean, that can be, I think that is, I find that reaction of I don't feel like my kid cares, or they didn't ask enough questions, or they're not showing enough emotion, is when the kids are like older, and especially teenagers. I found like parents have an expectation of how their child is supposed to respond.
Yeah. I I found that really, any age that can happen, because some might think, even, the little ones and the one in that kind of preschool, younger school age gap, um, might have all the concerns or might want extra snuggles with mom, when nope, they really only care, are you still going to be driving me to school? So that too, that can really depend. And a lot of it is just trying to normalize it for parents, because um sometimes they're like, oh my gosh, this is, they're regressing in certain ways, or now she wants to sleep in bed with me every night. And talking about what are some of the normal responses and reactions, what are some of the questions that I might be able to expect, but we might not be at that point of addressing, can be nice to know some of those ahead of time. um
So
but
are there certain kind of like, I mean, understanding there's sort of variety,
Mhm.
like what would you say are some of the normal reactions? And I would imagine like, I mean, I think of it as sort of like preschool, kind of grade school, and high school sort of being sort of the developmental groups. That it's sort of how I think of it. Yeah, you're nodding, so I'm not far off. Um, like, are there sort of, this would be normal if you encountered this at those different ages?
Mhm. Yes, there absolutely are, and that's generally how we would, you know, try to group it. Again, not everybody is going to like fall right into those categories, but um, for those younger ones, um, there's these three questions that we always, usually encounter are: did I cause it? Can I catch it? And who will take care of me?
Mm,
So those younger kids, right? They're egocentric, so a lot of parents too might be surprised, thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to devastate them. And you know when really then they kind of care about how it then pertains to them, right?
yeah.
So certainly addressing those concerns, right, of nothing that you did or anybody else did caused this. You can't catch it, so helping differentiate that with kids, that's common too, especially why it's important to use the word cancer, because it can be hard if you say I'm sick. Some
Yeah.
people say, use the word sick for when you have a cold or a stomach ache. So addressing some of those. Um,
And can I say, I would imagine that being particularly important in this time of COVID, because certainly I think
right,
kids having anxiety and different ways of conceptualizing COVID, that
right.
I would imagine, I mean, I know even my own child, her little feelers are up about the COVID germs, that to say somebody's sick is just,
Yeah,
she's going to create a story. They're going to create a story.
so true. And talking about, can I catch it, right? About how we're all, taking precautions to not spread germs and such. And an added layer too with COVID is kids understanding how, that a parent might be more vulnerable now, or how serious
Mm,
it is, depending on what their, typical precautions were perhaps before the
mm,
diagnosis. So certainly that's something to help explain. And there are some really good books and worksheets, things that just kind of can help give parents the language to use, um, to explain that. So to help kids differentiate that.
mm,
Um, and then I think, that last one of who's going to take care of me. So a big reaction from those younger kids is usually that routine is so important. So in any way that you can, keeping a routine, and if there are going to be changes, involving them in it, preparing them for it. um, that's usually where you'll see kind of the biggest disturbances in their life, or when
mm.
routines kind of fall out of whack.
Thrown off. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're not going to be able to help it. Sometimes you're going to have appointments, and you're going to have maybe family or friends stepping in, and that's okay, and that's
Yeah.
needed. But just being aware that that's probably gonna, set them off a little bit. Um, I think for that next age group, school age, a little bit older, um, details are usually starting to be more important. So, um, sometimes things that parents didn't even expect them to ask, of like really, wanting to know like the nitty gritty of a surgery, or
Mm.
what treatment is doing, where you're going exactly. So making sure that, again, you have the language to help explain that, um, and give them the information that they're looking for. I would say let them kind of guide you in that, and let them ask them the question, so then you know what information they want.
Mm-hmm.
You're not overloading them. Um, and then teens, for the most part, teens are going to be able to receive information like an adult would. Um, with the language that you would use. And I think, some of those typical responses and reactions too that can be tough are like privacy and peer support are huge for teens. So
Mm-hmm.
understanding that, even for older school age, that unfortunately, you as the parent might not be their go-to to talk to
Mm.
about what's going on. And that
Yeah.
can be hard to not feel a little shut out.
Yeah.
But that's normal. That's a normal teen response. And, um, to, allow the kids and teens to still be kids and teenagers as much as possible during this, because, um, although, we might look and know this is a really important time for the kids to be spending with their family, and, doing all of this together, you still don't want to disrupt some of just that normal, development that they need.
Yeah.
So important. So just remembering that,
Well,
that's
I think there's that, when I've worked with parents that have teens, there's sort of this natural push pull of, this is that age where they are kind of preparing to leave the nest and be more independent, and then may feel pulled back, either they themselves, or I think something else that I encounter, especially with parents that have older children, is expectations of how involved their teenager should be, either on their own, like wanting their child, their teenager to intuitively be there, lending a hand. Um, or I think another thing I've encountered is parents who maybe had, I don't want to say low, but maybe low on the spectrum of expectations of how their children contributed to the household. And that with the cancer diagnosis, that just like totally spikes. So, like a kid who never did their own laundry now is supposed to do their own laundry. A kid who didn't cook is now supposed to be preparing meals. And I see the parent where they're in the state of like, why is my kid not helping?
yeah, yeah, that's a great point. I think that can be hard because, right, the family's under stress, and so it's kind of like all hands on deck. But again, understanding what is this, the true role, right, of this
Yeah.
teenager, of this child within the home, within the family. And, um, it can be, hard if there is older children that can help out with things around the house more, or young children. I wouldn't say, to totally like nix that and not set any expectations, but to talk about it and to see, a lot of the times kids will want to help, will feel that, how can I help mom feel better or make things better?
Yeah.
So give them those opportunities, but I would try not to make those demands on them, because then, right, it can cause some of this tension and resentment, and, um, can be really tough, and you want to set them up for success. So even the young kids, of how to get them involved, right?
Yeah.
Having them help out with things around the house that make them feel good, make them feel like they're contributing, but aren't now seen as a new chore because mom has cancer. um,
Hmm.
you don't want them, just kind of associating it with that in such a negative way. And, that kind of goes too for, setting higher expectations and then setting lower. I think it's also pretty common that I see, Kids
Hmm.
maybe having a harder time in school or not keeping up with their chores at home right now because they're going through something really hard.
Yeah.
Um, and while that can also be expected and is something to work through with them, we don't want parents all of a sudden now to just be lowering that bar of, okay, you
Hmm.
don't have to go to school. You don't have to worry about that. There's a balance. I'm certainly not going to say don't change anything or don't be lenient, but these are things that are still important for kids and that keep them focused and on track in other areas of their life that they need that stability.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So just to make sure that you have a good balance there of those expectations.
I almost, as you're talking, I like envision like a bowling alley where they've got the bumpers,
Yeah.
so that the ball can't go in the gutter. And like, the ball can, well, most bowling balls don't go like this down the lane, but the ball can move within this sort of range of this is where we want it to be. And maybe it gets close to more leniency and maybe it gets like closer to higher expectations, but we don't want it to go
Yep.
too far in either direction because either direction can can create its own challenges, concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of looking at it.
That's my little analogy, metaphor. I guess it's a metaphor. Um, you mentioned something in there about like getting children involved, and so curious, like if you do have a kid who is wanting, I think especially with the younger kids, I think sometimes with the older kids, it might be easier to think about ways to involve them. But
Mhm.
like if you've got a younger child who is asking to go to treatment or is like really wanting to find some way of being involved, like what are the ways that parents can help bring that child in?
Yeah. I think it's so important to do that, especially if the children are looking for that. Um, right now, it can be a really hard time where visitations are, limited um, and people are home a lot more. But um, there's a lot of different creative ways that you can involve your kids in your treatment. Um, Many times, kids will worry, when mom's gone for however many hours at chemo or at her appointments, like, where is she? Who is she with?
Mm,
So even doing, you know, um, as a child life specialist, what we would often do is have pictures of the nurses or
mm,
the room that mom will be in, what the hospital looks like, just to show them and kind of make sure that they're, again, just like in the loop. Um, we'll do like chemo cards where kids can make new pictures or cards each time the
mm,
parent goes in for treatment or anything like that, being a part of it. Um, Certainly going themselves if a parent is in the hospital for um, whether even a short or extended stay. um, I think with the right preparation it is almost always appropriate for kids to go and visit. Certainly there'll be some circumstances where that might not be or the family chooses not. um, but I think again a lot of the times we just get stuck in our own fear of what they might think and this might be too hard for them, when really if you just equip them with the right information and and prepare them and support them during it, they can be much more involved than we may think.
well, and there, as you're talking about that idea of like kind of the virtual tour of this is what, mommy or daddy's treatment nurses and looks the treatment facility looks like,
Hmm.
it just struck me like their attention span, I mean, even a school age kid's attention span is probably not going to be that long, right? Like giving them that information up front, I would imagine for many kids is going to satisfy them. Like this isn't going to be like
Yeah,
an hour long discussion about the ins and outs of treatment. Like they're not going to, maybe an older kid may get more detailed in that way, but a little can go a long way, I guess is what I'm saying.
absolutely. And I think that's the way to approach it is when the questions are asked, you give just enough information. Um, and then if they keep asking or if things come up, certainly then, okay, I can give a little bit more. But there is no need, especially for the really young children, to kind of overload them with information they won't understand or won't, really resonate with them.
Yeah. So, I think we've been talking really about kind of the kids that are in that bowling lane, right? They're headed towards the pins, they're on their path. What are some signs that a kid is maybe veering out of that sort of normal range and may need a little bit more support, or may even need just to be like assessed to see where they're at?
Sure. And I would suggest too, I think it's okay even for the kids that are, in a good spot. It never hurts to make sure to kind of like set your support up so it's there.
Yeah.
Because it can be hard, right? We don't want to like scramble when things maybe go bad.
Yeah.
Um, but certainly just looking for patterns in kids. For really young kids, oftentimes it's I just usually recommend like watching their play. You kind of
Hmm.
see that play is changing, hearing what they're saying. Kids often mimic a lot of what's going on around them, and they'll model conversations that they overhear mom and dad having, or
Hmm.
that nature. Playing doctor with them, you can get a lot of information there of like,
Hmm.
are they understanding everything, or they seem really frustrated or angry about this, that it might be nice to like explore that. Whether it's just the parent then revisiting conversations, or seeing if it might be nice, and helpful to have outside support.
Yeah.
um, Older kids, it can be certainly like if there are any changes in like sleep, appetite, those are just some kind of bigger warning signs that something, might be going on and that they're struggling a little bit. Um, Behavioral changes, a lot of the times I tell parents it's things they would normally like catch on to. So it's not necessarily going to be something like that they should be worried that they won't see necessarily.
Mm.
um but important too to involve school. um
Yeah.
that's something I usually suggest right off the bat. With some older kids, there's a little bit of hesitancy around that as far as that privacy goes, so just involving them in that conversation of, this is as far as I'm going to go with telling someone at school. You can decide then, if you want to utilize that or if your friends know. So still having some of those boundaries, but explaining to them like, this is necessary. I'm just trying to make sure that you have people, that can be there for you and kind of wherever you are. So when I'm not with you.
Do you find, over the last year, as the experience of school has been so different, I think is putting it mildly, both for school, but also just in general, sort of the multiple stressors,
Mhm.
right? There's a conflation of stressors.
Yeah.
Have you found in any way that that impacts how you advise parents, or what you advise parents as far as what to look out for, or how to distinguish like cancer related distress from COVID related distress?
That's a good question, and I would say to talk about it to see if, um, again, just to try to be transparent in that of, if you are having a worry about something, instead of trying to do some of your own investigating,
Mm.
bringing it to them and just saying, this is kind of where I'm at, because then they might open up more, right? If you're saying, I feel like you're not really talking to me so much, and I can imagine this is a lot on you, and um, do you want to, are you interested in counseling or talking to someone? And if right away they're like, no, well, then the parent can maybe even, that's an opportunity of being like, well, I need you to talk to someone, right? Like, so let it be me then. Like, let's talk. And just kind of
Hmm.
showing them, because again, you want to respect their privacy and independence, but they're still a teenager and you're still their parent. So it's okay to like try to set some of those like guidelines and boundaries of like, how am I going to know you're okay? Like, let's make a deal here of like, what's, like, or who are you going to go to? It's okay if it's a family friend and that's who you want to talk to or whatever, but you know, let's figure out a way for me to know this best. And but absolutely, I think this part, and everybody's home, and especially then when there is, cancer in the family, it's kind of like for everybody, you're stuck there with it, and that's a lot, on kids too. So taking that into consideration. And you froze on me. You still there, Priscilla?
Oh, okay. Did you
Oh,
lose me there first?
you are. I did. Uh-oh. And now you're on mute.
I'm not back. Goodness. See, everybody, here we are. We're literally a year and 2 days into this, and we can still have technical difficulties. Good God. See, therapists are human too. Um, I think I, I have one last question, but I think you kind of already answered it for me, because I think another thing that I find that comes up, and I have to imagine that you hear it too, which is, well, my oldest, they're really sensitive and emotional. So I know how they're feeling. But my middle child, I just never talks about their feelings. I don't know how they're doing. And I think they need support, right? The expectation is if they're not talking about how they're feeling, that means it's a problem.
Mm.
So it just, it seems like what you were saying is the idea of like just opening the dialogue and kind of the permission that you don't have to talk to me, but do you have somebody that you can go to? Like, we need to identify somebody that you can talk to if you're having a hard time. Is that sort of the similar guidance that you would give if a parent says, well, this child just doesn't talk as much or doesn't talk about how they're feeling as much with me?
I would say so, but I would also probably ask, is that typical? Is that just more kind of like their
They
baseline, their
are.
personality, right? Because if they're saying, yeah, my middle one just doesn't talk about things much, then it's kind of normal that they're then not being as expressive and, open about this.
Yeah.
It would be more of a concern if it wasn't in line with how they typically behaved and express themselves.
Yeah.
um, Certainly, I know when something like this is going on, you want to know how your kids are feeling, but I would just see again, if it's out of the ordinary, that's when it might be more um, concerning. But it's never, um, if you're in doubt, I don't think it's ever a bad um, time to just see if they do want to talk to somebody, whether it's through Cancer Wellness Center, through the school. um, it can always just be healthy and helpful to kids, even if it doesn't have to be very long term, or um, as in
Yeah.
as they think.
Yeah. Takeaway here is, I think any therapist is going to say, just talk about it,
Yeah.
right? Just talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that idea of taking, as a parent, taking the lead of opening up that conversation, which can be anxiety provoking maybe at first, but in the long run
Hmm.
is going to benefit
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. I looking at the time, I can't believe it's 1 o'clock, right? I feel like there's more we could talk about, but that's how I always feel with these things. So of course I'm going to rope you into coming back again to talk more about parents and kids, and kind of want to end just to see if you could talk about maybe favorite resource, if there's a book or a website you recommend, and then also what what services or opportunities there are at the center to support families.
Yes. And of course, the book that I don't have it handy. I'd forgotten, but I do have a go-to book that I love, and it's Supporting Kids When a Parent is Ill. Just and it's written by a leading child life specialist, gives really really good resources and recommendations, and kind of how I mentioned, just like that language. I also have, a helpful list of just children's books, all on whether it's treatment or hair loss, a specific type of cancer, that can be helpful. There's a lot out there, so I know it can be hard to kind
Yeah.
of pick through what works best for you. Um, but then I think too, just reaching out to us at Cancer Wellness Center for a parent consultation, even just to talk through some of this that we talked about. Right, I'm ready to have this conversation. Just want to like bounce this off of someone and make sure I'm on the right page. To not hesitate, and I think parents, it's natural to put your kids first, but you can't pour from an empty cup. So take care of yourselves and get the support that you need.
Yeah,
Then be the best you can for your kids.
that's great. Michelle, thank you so much. I so appreciate it. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has too. So I so appreciate you being here and appreciate you being a part of our team.
Me
Yeah,
too. Thanks so
yeah,
much, Priscilla.
yeah. Well, thank you guys for being here, whether it was via Zoom or Facebook Live, or you're joining us on YouTube after the 17th. And we will be back here next month, and I look forward to you joining us then. Thanks. Bye.